Bullies cut her dress in front of school. Her flying kick sent him into a wall. Aria Nakamura had learned long ago that silence was her shield. At 17, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that seemed to make her invisible in the crowded hallways of Westfield High. Her petite frame, barely 5'3", moved through the school like a shadow, dark hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, oversized sweaters hiding her small build. 3 months since her family had moved from Tokyo, and she still felt like a stranger navigating foreign territory. The language barrier had mostly dissolved, but the cultural one remained as solid as concrete. While other students gathered in loud clusters, sharing jokes and weekend plans, Aria ate lunch alone, completed assignments without speaking, and avoided eye contact whenever possible. She had perfected the art of being unremarkable. What none of them knew was that beneath those loose-fitting clothes lived muscles trained since childhood. Every morning at 5, while her classmates slept, Aria practiced forms her grandfather had taught her in their small apartment's living room. Kyokushin karate flowed through her veins like blood, each technique memorized through countless repetitions. Her father had been a champion before an injury ended his career, and her grandfather before him had trained fighters in Okinawa. But here, in this American high school, she was just the quiet Asian girl who spoke softly and kept to herself. Just get through the day, she reminded herself each morning. Don't draw attention. Don't give them reasons. The bullying had started small, whispered comments about her accent when she spoke in class. Ching Chong muttered just loud enough for her to hear as she passed certain lockers. Books, accidentally, knocked from her hands in crowded hallways. She endured it all with the same serene expression she wore during meditation, never retaliating, never even acknowledging the attacks. The main instigator was Brad Morrison, a hulking 6-foot linebacker whose family had dominated Westfield's social hierarchy for generations. His sandy hair was always perfectly styled, his Letterman jacket worn like armor, and his cruel blue eyes seemed to find weakness the way sharks detected blood. His closest allies were Tommy Rodriguez, lean and quick with a nasty smile, and Derek Walsh, whose red hair matched his explosive temper. "Look what crawled out of the rice paddy," Brad would announce whenever Aria entered the cafeteria. His table would erupt in laughter while she pretended not to hear, finding her usual spot near the windows where she could eat in relative peace. Mrs. Henderson, the overworked lunch monitor, always seemed to be looking elsewhere when these incidents occurred. The other teachers were either oblivious or chose ignorance over intervention. Even the students who might have spoken up found reasons to look away. Aria understood. Getting involved meant becoming a target. She had dealt with worse in Tokyo, where her mixed heritage made her stand out among her fully Japanese classmates. At least here, she told herself, the isolation felt temporary. Her father's job transfer would likely move them again within a year or two. She just had to survive until then. The gymnasium was her sanctuary during lunch periods, when the cafeteria became unbearable. Most students avoided the empty space, but Aria found peace among the equipment and echo of her footsteps. She would sit in the bleachers, finishing homework, or simply breathing in the familiar scent of athletic mats that reminded her of her grandfather's dojo. It was there, on a Tuesday in November, that Brad and his crew cornered her for the first time. Well, little China doll thinks she can hide from us." Brad's voice bounced off the gymnasium walls as he approached with Tommy and Derek flanking him. "We've been looking all over for you." Aria closed her textbook slowly, her heart rate steady despite the threat. Years of training had taught her to remain calm under pressure. Assess the situation. Look for exits. Stay ready. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Tommy sneered, stepping closer. "Or do you only speak fortune cookie?" Derek laughed, a harsh sound that seemed too loud in the empty space. "Maybe she's praying to her Buddha statue or whatever." I need to get to class, Arya said quietly, standing and gathering her books. Her voice remained steady, betraying none of the calculations running through her mind. 3 opponents, all larger but confined space, limited their ability to surround her completely. Class doesn't start for 20 minutes, Brad said, blocking her path to the exit. We want to have a little chat first. About what? She asked, though she already knew this conversation had nothing to do with communication and everything to do with establishing dominance. About respect, Brad said, his smile turning predatory. See, we don't appreciate foreigners coming into our school and acting like they own the place. I don't act like anything, Arya replied. I just want to be left alone. That's the problem, Tommy chimed in. You think you're too good for us, walking around like some mysterious ninja princess. Arya almost smiled at that. If only they knew how close to the truth they were. Look, she said, trying to step around Brad. I don't want any trouble. Brad grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not yet painful. Nobody said you could leave. For just a moment, Arya felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded action. Her muscles tensed, ready to break his grip with a simple wrist rotation that would leave him gasping on the floor. But she forced herself to relax. Not yet. Not unless you have no choice. Please let me go, she said instead. Brad's grip tightened. Say, please, Master Brad. No. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Derek cracked his knuckles while Tommy moved to block any alternate escape route. The sound of the gymnasium door opening saved her from whatever would have happened next. Hey, what's going on in here? Coach Martinez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You kids know you're not supposed to be in here during lunch. Brad released Arya's arm immediately, his expression shifting to innocent confusion. Just talking to the new girl, Coach. Making her feel welcome. Coach Martinez's suspicious gaze moved between them, but Arya had already learned that adults rarely saw what they didn't want to see. Well, welcome her somewhere else. Gym's off limits. As they filed out, Brad whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "This isn't over, China doll." That night, Arya practiced until her muscles screamed. In the privacy of her family's small apartment, she moved through forms with lethal precision, imagining each block and strike connecting with real targets. Her grandfather had always said that true strength lay not in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary. She could still feel Brad's grip on her arm, the casual way he had assumed ownership of her space, her time, her very presence. The memory ignited something dangerous in her chest. Her movements became sharper, more aggressive, each kata executed with barely contained fury. Her mother watched from the kitchen doorway, recognizing the signs of inner turmoil in her daughter's precise violence. "Arya-chan," she called softly, "is everything all right at school?" "Fine, Mama," Arya replied without breaking form, her fist cutting through the air where an imaginary opponent's ribs would be. Just staying in practice. But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Her mother had seen those same movements in her husband's training, back when he prepared for competitions that mattered. This wasn't practice, this was preparation for war. When will that time come? She wondered, sweat dripping onto the worn carpet. Deep in her heart, she suspected it would be soon. The harassment escalated gradually over the following weeks. Brad and his friends seemed to take her silence as invitation rather than deterrent. They began timing their movements to hers, appearing wherever she tried to find solitude. The library became hostile territory when they took to making loud, mocking conversations about immigrants taking over. The hallways turned into gauntlets, where she never knew when someone would shoulder check her into a locker. The worst part was how invisible it all seemed to everyone else. Teachers looked right through the subtle torment happening under their noses. Other students developed selective blindness whenever Brad's crew struck. The conspiracy of willful ignorance felt more suffocating than the actual bullying. "Just ignore them," her mother advised when Arya finally mentioned having some social difficulties at school. Show them you're better than their behavior. Her father, nursing his perpetually aching knee, was more direct. You want me to go to the school? Talk to the principal? No, Dad. I can handle it. And she believed she could. Years of training had prepared her for far worse than teenage cruelty. But as November turned to December, the incidents grew bolder, more public, more humiliating. The breaking point came on a Friday before winter break. Arya had worn her favorite dress to school that day, a simple blue cotton piece her grandmother had sent from Japan. It was one of the few items that made her feel connected to home, and she'd been looking forward to wearing it to the small holiday party her one friendly acquaintance, Sarah, had invited her to attend. She was walking toward her last class when Brad stepped directly into her path. "Well, look at this," he announced loudly, drawing attention from dozens of nearby students. "Princess Asia decided to dress up for us." A crowd began to gather, sensing drama. Arya tried to step around him, but Tommy and Derek appeared, completing the human wall that trapped her in the hallway intersection. "That's a pretty dress," Brad continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "Shame it makes you look like a geisha who got lost." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Arya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. "Walk away. Find another route. Don't engage." "Where are you going, sweetheart?" Brad asked as she turned. "We're just getting started." "Leave me alone," she said quietly, but her words were lost in the growing noise of entertained spectators. "What was that?" Brad cupped his ear dramatically. "Sorry, I don't speak Chinese." "She said leave her alone," Sarah's voice cut through the crowd. Arya's heart sank as her only friend pushed forward, trying to help. "Come on, Brad, just let her go to class." "Oh, look," Tommy sneered, "the geisha has a white savior." "Back off, Sarah," Derek added. "This doesn't concern you." "Bullying concerns everyone," Sarah replied, though Arya could hear the tremor in her voice. Brad's eyes lit up with malicious inspiration. "You know what? You're right. This does concern everyone." He raised his voice to address the entire hallway. "Everyone should see what happens to people who think they're too good for American hospitality." Before Arya could react, Brad reached out and grabbed the neckline of her dress. With one violent motion, he yanked downward, tearing the delicate fabric from collar to hem. The sound of ripping cotton seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. Arya stood frozen, her dress hanging in tatters, her white slip visible to dozens of staring eyes. The careful composure she'd maintained for months cracked like ice under pressure. Humiliation burned through her chest as phones appeared, recording her exposure for digital immortality. This is what helplessness feels like, she realized with crystal clarity. This is what happens when you let others define your boundaries. "Oops," Brad said with mock concern. "Looks like your cheap foreign clothes can't handle American strength." Something fundamental shifted inside Arya's chest. The part of her that had counseled patience and peace suddenly went silent, replaced by a voice that sounded exactly like her grandfather's. "Some battles choose you, Arya-chan. When they do, you must be ready." She looked up at Brad, and for the first time since arriving at Westfield High, she met his gaze directly. What he saw there made his satisfied smirk falter slightly. "You just made a very big mistake," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. Brad recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do about it, China?" He never finished the word. Arya moved like lightning given form. Her right foot snapped upward in a perfect mawashi geri, connecting with Brad's solar plexus with surgical precision. The kick lifted him completely off his feet, sending him flying backward into the metal lockers with a crash that shook the entire hallway. The sound of his body hitting steel was followed by perfect silence. Brad slumped to the floor, gasping for breath that wouldn't come, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. His friends stared in shock as this tiny girl who had never raised her voice suddenly stood like a warrior goddess in the middle of their conquered territory. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Tommy was the first to recover, lunging forward with his fists raised. Arya sidestepped his wild swing with fluid grace, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him face first into the same lockers that had just acquainted themselves with Brad. The metallic clang of his impact was followed by the distinct sound of his nose breaking. Derek, seeing his two friends crumpled on the floor, backpedaled rapidly. "Jesus Christ, what the hell are you?" Arya didn't answer. She simply reached down and gathered the torn pieces of her dress, holding them against her chest while maintaining eye contact with every person in the hallway. Her breathing was perfectly controlled, her stance relaxed but ready. She looked like someone who could end worlds without breaking a sweat. "I am someone who tried very hard to avoid this moment," she said finally, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. "I am someone who believed that walking away was strength, that silence was wisdom, that peace was always possible." She looked down at Brad, who was still struggling to breathe normally. "I was wrong." The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea as she walked toward the nearest bathroom. Behind her, Brad finally managed to wheeze out something that might have been an apology, but she didn't turn around. "Let them remember this," she thought, as she pushed through the bathroom door. "Let them all remember what happens when peaceful people reach their limit." The aftermath was swift and decisive. By the time Arya emerged from the bathroom wearing her gym clothes, the principal was waiting with 2 security guards and a very pale-looking Brad Morrison. His friends had been taken to the nurse's office, Tommy for his broken nose, Derek for what appeared to be a panic attack. "Miss Nakamura," Principal Hayes said carefully, "we need to talk." The conversation in his office was surreal. Brad, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him, mumbled through an explanation that painted him as the victim of an unprovoked attack. His version of events conveniently omitted the torn dress, the months of harassment, or any context that might explain her actions. "Is this true?" Principal Hayes asked Arya. "Did you assault Mr. Morrison without provocation?" Arya considered her options. She could lie, minimize, explain. She could try to make adults understand what they'd been willfully ignoring for months. Or she could simply own the moment completely. "Yes," she said calmly, "I did." Principal Hayes blinked, clearly having expected denials or excuses. "Can you explain why?" "He destroyed my dress in front of the entire school. He and his friends have been tormenting me for months while teachers and students watched and did nothing. Today, I decided I was done being their victim." "That doesn't justify violence," Principal Hayes began. "Doesn't it?" Arya interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm. "At what point does defending yourself become justified? After the 100th insult? After physical assault? After public humiliation? I'm curious where you draw that line, sir." The principal looked uncomfortable. Brad shifted in his chair, wincing from his bruised ribs. "There are proper channels," Principal Hayes said weakly. "Which channels?" Arya asked. "The teachers who looked the other way? The lunch monitors who were always distracted? The administrators who were too busy to notice months of systematic harassment? Those channels?" Principal Hayes had no good answer. The conversation ended with all parties receiving equal suspension. 3 days for fighting on school property. Brad's parents, pillars of the community, were outraged that their son was being punished for being brutally attacked by a foreign student. Arya's parents, after hearing the full story, quietly supported their daughter while publicly expressing appropriate concern for all involved. The real changes began when classes resumed. Arya returned to school to find herself transformed from invisible target to visible force. Students parted in hallways, but now it was from respect rather than indifference. The whispered conversations followed her movements, but the tone had shifted completely. Did you see what she did to Brad Morrison? One kick and he was finished. She moves like she's in a movie. I heard she's been training since she was little. Tommy's nose is never going to look right again. Brad himself had become a cautionary tale. The swaggering bully who had terrorized younger students was now the laughingstock who got demolished by a girl half his size. His friends gave him a wide berth, unwilling to be associated with such spectacular defeat. His girlfriend dumped him, citing embarrassment as the reason. The most significant change was in how others behaved around Arya. Students who had watched her torment for months without intervention suddenly seemed to remember their voices. "I'm sorry," Sarah said during lunch that first day back. "I should have spoken up sooner. Way sooner." "We all should have," added Marcus Chen, a quiet boy who had witnessed many of the incidents. "What we did was wrong. What we didn't do was worse." Even some teachers seemed to regard Arya differently. Mr. Peterson, her history teacher, stopped her after class. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I saw what was happening and convinced myself it wasn't my business. That was cowardice on my part." "It's okay," Arya replied, though they both knew it wasn't. "No, it's not. But thank you for handling it yourself when the adults in your life failed you." The strangest transformation was in Brad Morrison himself. The broken nose had healed, but something deeper remained damaged. He no longer strutted through hallways like a conquering hero. His cruelty toward other students simply stopped, as if her kick had knocked the bully right out of him. 2 weeks after the incident, he approached her locker. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Arya closed her locker and turned to face him, noting how he unconsciously took a step backward. "Okay. I wanted to say..." He struggled with words that had never been part of his vocabulary. "I'm sorry. For everything. The dress, the comments, all of it. I was wrong." Arya studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. She found only genuine remorse and something that might have been fear. "Why?" she asked. "Because you were right. About what you said in the principal's office. There should have been a line, and I crossed it a long time ago. I never thought about what it felt like from your side. And now you do." Brad nodded, his earlier confidence completely absent. "I keep thinking about how scared you must have been, how alone you felt. I made someone feel that way on purpose, and that's..." He struggled for the word. "That's evil." Arya felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the absence of active anger. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "It doesn't undo what happened, but it matters that you understand." "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Brad continued, "but I want you to know that I'll never do anything like that again, to you or anyone else." As he walked away, Arya realized that her grandfather had been right about more than just fighting. True strength wasn't just knowing when to act, it was knowing when to show mercy to defeated enemies. The rest of the school year passed quietly. Arya's reputation as someone not to be trifled with spread throughout Westfield High, but more importantly, she had found her voice. She spoke up in classes, joined the school's cultural awareness club, and even convinced the administration to implement a more effective anti-bullying program. Other students began approaching her, not just those seeking protection, but those who recognized in her the kind of quiet strength they wished to develop themselves. She started an informal martial arts club that met after school, teaching basic self-defense to anyone who wanted to learn. "The goal isn't to hurt people," she would tell her students. "The goal is to be so clearly capable of protecting yourself that no one ever tests that capability." Her favorite student was a small freshman named Kevin, who reminded her of herself just months earlier. Shy, bookish, and frequently targeted by older students, he had joined her club out of desperation. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he confided after his first lesson. "I just want them to leave me alone." That's exactly right, Arya replied. Violence should always be the last option, but sometimes people won't give you any other choice. When that moment comes, you need to be ready. On the last day of school, Arya found a note in her locker. It was from Sarah, who had become a genuine friend over the final months. Thank you for showing all of us what real courage looks like. Not the fake kind that comes from hurting people weaker than you, but the real kind that comes from standing up when it matters most. You changed everything here, and I hope you know that. Arya smiled, folding the note carefully. She had indeed changed everything, not just at Westfield High, but within herself. The quiet girl who had arrived in September was gone, replaced by someone who understood that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. Her grandfather would have been proud. She had learned that true warriors fight not because they love violence, but because they love something enough to protect it. Sometimes that something was others. Sometimes it was simply their own dignity. As she walked out of Westfield High for the last time, Arya carried herself differently. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more direct, her presence more substantial. She was no longer invisible, no longer a target, no longer afraid. She was Arya Nakamura, and she had learned that the strongest people are often those who choose not to use their strength until the moment when they absolutely must. The torn dress had been beyond repair, but what it represented had been rebuilt stronger than ever. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that teach everyone watching that there are consequences for cruelty, that victims can become victors, and that quiet people should never be mistaken for powerless people. Brad Morrison learned that lesson the hard way. So did everyone else at Westfield High, who had chosen to look away when looking was what was needed most. But most importantly, Arya learned that she had been strong enough all along. She had just needed to find the moment when being strong mattered more than staying safe.